Today I'm going to go over kind of the recent 2020 EPA guidance. There's some draft guidance, there's some final guidance, and there are some draft rules as well as some final rules. But I kind of go through all of those, some in more detail than others, and with the half hour that I have today. Try to pick the ones that are most interesting as the ones that I'll dive into the most. And of course, as luck would have it, the first one I had that I was going to go through was the temporary COVID-19 enforcement policy, but Gary already went through that in great detail. So thank you, Gary. Story of my life that my thunder is stolen by an earlier presenter. But I'll have the slides on there for that. So if you want to, in your mind, kind of couple Gary's detailed review of that, and then my slides on just having the words there in front of you and the slides later on, that's going to be a great combination for you. I'll also go through a draft guidance document, the interpretation of begin actual construction that EPA prepared in March 2020. The comment period has closed on that, but it hasn't become a final guidance document yet, but we'll go through that one. It's probably the most aggressive one that was released in 2020. Then EPA also has a draft rule that's out there. It's known as the Bca Rule, Benefit Cost Analysis Rule. Initially, for me, this was kind of a head scratcher. I couldn't exactly figure out what EPA was trying to do. And then as I dove into it, I dove into it back in June, but as I dove into it, it became very clear at the end what EPA was trying to do. So I'll try to lead you up to that and give you the insight as to why EPA might have been putting out this draft rule. And then EPA had both a draft and now a final guidance on PAL permits. I've been lucky enough to do a whole lot of PAL permitting over the years. So I've had some rather animated conversations with EPA, and I'll kind of go into those details when I hit that final guidance memorandum from EPA. Also have two more that I won't go into detail today. The first one is the guidance to states from EPA on their startup shutdown and malfunctions as they incorporate those into their SIP plans. That was released in October of this year, just recently. That's more for the states, aka Mississippi, to deal with rather than regulated entities. When Mississippi comes out with their draft rules on the SIP, I'm sure you all will be much more interested to what Mississippi decides to do with their SSM revisions. But I asked a few of my colleagues that were more in depth with this rule than I was, and their basic response to me was it's a lot of words that make no clarifications. So it seems like EPA spent a lot of time to not clear up a lot of the muddy waters on this one. And then I'm sure everyone's favorite is the once in, always in policy. EPA has come up with a pre-publication final version of that rule. It's now a rule, not a guidance document. So that was released again in October, so just recently. I'll kind of give you a lowdown here on this one. That, you know, when something's guidance out there that EPA releases either in draft or final form, if you are a SIP approved state like Mississippi is, you don't necessarily have to follow it. But when something's a rule, which this is now a rule, states actually are compelled to follow what EPA has put into the rulemaking in the Code of Federal Regulations or the Federal Register. There may be a time gap with that, but eventually all states will follow in line with that one. So that is now a rule, and it should be released in the Federal Register at any day now. So like I said before, Gary went through the temporary COVID policy pretty quickly. If you want more information, there is a web link that I provided on the right side of the screen there. And for each one of these guidance memos, including this one or these two, I'll go into in detail what it does, how it works, and then some key examples. So I'll do that kind of quickly here for the COVID, since you've already heard about it. As I said, as Gary pointed out, there are two memorandums out there: the initial allowance policy in March, and then the termination policy in June. So the policy actually goes from March 13th to August 31st. And as Gary pointed out, any COVID related lapses in compliance after August 31st, 2020 can be handled on a case-by-case basis, and EPA has said explicitly that they will do that. So it doesn't necessarily end that you will get some beneficial review after August 31st. It's just this policy officially ends on August 31st. So this is what you are supposed to do for any non-compliance issues related to COVID. As Gary pointed out, these are the 5 items that you'll have to have. And the key one here is the documentation at the bottom. And then these are kind of some of the areas where EPA has identified that they are expecting some COVID-related lapses in compliance. So just for some examples that I'll spend some more time on before I move on to some of the things that you haven't heard earlier today. Monitoring, I have had a few clients that basically staff just didn't come in, or they were shifted over to something more safety related during the day. So we may have missed some sampling or some monitoring. I did have some labs that were closed during the COVID, so timely analysis of laboratory samples was hard to come across early on in the COVID policy. I think most of the labs have found a way to open back up, so that's not necessarily an issue anymore, but it was early on. So if you have a Title V semi-annual report or annual compliance certification, and that was an issue, obviously you'll want to document that. Training, I am methadone certified, and I know that my training got canceled right in the beginning of March when COVID hit. So what EPA said for those or similar trainings, that they would allow the certification to lapse, but they wanted you to keep using the people that were previously certified. And now I think most of the methadone certifications are back on. I just got my recertification last month over here. And then we talked about earlier, Gary did that you can scan and email a lot of your certifications in. They don't necessarily need the wet ink signature on those. So that's kind of the how, or what, how, and examples for the COVID policy there that I will just want to go through briefly, and you'll have these slides as well in case you need it. So on new stuff for you here. First one being the interpretation of begin actual construction under the NSR pre-construction permitting regulations. Again, there is a website for that. All of this policy on EPA's website there, and that's the link for it. As I said before, it's a pretty aggressive policy. It actually undoes years and years of previously policy memos that said kind of the exact opposite. So how is EPA doing that? Well, first I want to point out that this is draft guidance. This is not final guidance. So there's no way to compel Mississippi to follow draft guidance just yet. So EPA might be updating this. They may not. I would expect them to update a few things in here based on a lot of feedback I know they were getting. But basically, EPA is exploiting the definition of begin actual construction, which they feel was not well defined in previous guidance memos or in the 40 CFR 5221. So now they want to basically pull that definition of begin actual construction into only the emissions unit itself. So what they're saying here is that when you're getting a PSD construction permit or non-attainment new source review construction permit, that waiting on that permit to begin actual construction only applies to the emission unit itself. As I said before, that is in contrast to a lot of previous guidance that EPA has released, and I'll explain why they think they can reverse that at this time. So many of you, if you're in the regulated entity side, think that this will be a big benefit to you. you'll be allowed to build foundations or other costly structures. You'll be allowed to bring utilities in to an emissions unit. You just won't be able to build the emissions unit while you wait on Mississippi and sometimes EPA to agree on a permit, a pre-construction permit for you. But also, I've talked to some state agencies about this, and they think it'll be a benefit to them as well. What some of you know and some of you may not know is a lot of these construction permits, there is some pressure on the agency itself to get these construction permits issued. And there may be construction equipment waiting to move for the agency to get this construction permit out the door. And there won't be necessarily that strong push of pressure to push the state agencies to release these PSD permits so quickly. They can make sure that they get it right, and facilities can start building the foundations, et cetera, that they weren't allowed to before. EPA said that they can do this because they don't believe that there is leverage based on costly or permanent structures in the ground that there was or perceived to be early in the 1970s and 80s when they were developing these policies that they had before. So here's the EPA's official language out of the memo, stating that explicitly that you can undertake physical on-site activities that may be costly or permanent in nature, and furthermore that you can build buildings around what would be an emissions generating unit as long as you don't start construction on the emissions generating unit itself. So EPA has gone into explicit detail on what they will allow before, which is kind of a reverse in policy where before they might have said what they won't allow. So they have been very explicit in this memo, which I think I appreciate a lot, saying, now you know what you can do instead of EPA saying what you can't do and not explicitly saying what you can do. Like I said before, comment period ended in May of this rule, so we are just waiting for the final guidance document to come out. And as I said before, this is a guidance memo, it's not a rule, so states aren't necessarily required to follow this or apply this new guidance. If you are not an airhead or an air geek like I am, you may not be aware of some of these previous EPA memos that this policy is kind of reversing. There are actually two Reich memorandums out there. That's not a typo, one from 1978 and one from 1986. There's the Rasnick memo, the Houkamp memo in 1993. Both of those came out, and then a Seitz letter in 1995 that all said the exact opposite. It said that, if you were getting a PSD permit or a non-attainment new source review permit, you had to wait till that permit was issued before you put anything permanent in the ground, anything costly in the ground. You could do some grading and some site prep work, but anything permanent of nature had to wait. So I don't think there's actually a presentation I've ever done where I didn't name a Seitz guidance document out there. There's a lot of those, that's for sure. As I said before, foundations, enclosures, or buildings and infrastructure can be now commenced prior to the construction permit, or well, if this memo becomes final, can be. Again, this is a draft memo, but there are some drawbacks. I've certainly been a part of issues where a company or site gets a construction permit, but then all of a sudden things change and they're not ready to start construction. Remember, these PSD permits have expirations on them, 18 months, and if you want to extend that, you can get up to 36 months with a lot of these without getting a formal extension. So what happens in those is people said, okay, I'm not ready to build my entire site, so I might just build something small that's permanent in nature so that I can basically keep my permit active. I can remember one installation that I was building. I got a PSD permit for, and we went out there and built a foundation for an emergency generator just so that we could extend the permit for another 18 months while we got our plans modified to accommodate what we wanted to build or what was required to change in what we were building. So that allowance may go away, and it may not be well thought out by this guidance memorandum, is that there were some facilities that like to extend their permits for years by making small investments into their permanent investments into their site to keep those permit active. So there are ways around that. EPA has phased permit options out there if you are interested in those. That could extend these permits for years rather than the tried and true method of just building small things, small foundations and buildings at a site to keep it active while you rework the site. All right. Next memorandum that I introduced earlier is the Bca Rule, technically called the Increasing Consistency and Transparency in Considering Costs and Benefits in Rulemaking Process. This is a draft rule. So you'll find this in the Federal Register right now. It's commonly known as the Bca Rule, but they wanted to accomplish 3 things with this one. Again, I first looked at it and I said, why? Why are we doing this? So even with these 3 things that EPA identified, I think I was still asking myself why. But it charges EPA to prepare a BCA for all future significant proposed and final regulations. So with this rule, we are actually going to define what significant is. We're going to put a dollar figure on that. Secondly, we are going to develop a BCA in a prescribed fashion. Before, it wasn't really a prescribed fashion to develop these cost benefit analyses. Now they will do that, and there will be a cookbook on how to prepare BCAs for the future. And then EPA was adamant in this rule that they wanted to increase transparency. So in doing so, they wanted to follow the Executive Order 12866, which was developed under the Clinton administration. So they wanted to follow that. I believe they are doing that already, but that is now going to be codified into doing these benefit cost analyses. So the cookbook on what these BCAs look like is there's going to be now a statement of need. There's going to be an examination of regulatory options, and there's going to be an assessment of the benefits and costs for all of these options, as opposed to the no action scenario. So I said before that we're going to define significant, and EPA has done that in this draft rule. That is an annual impact of greater than $100 million on the economy. So EPA, and I couldn't find this necessarily in the rule, it doesn't look like EPA is tagging this to inflation. So that may be one of the comments they received on this draft rule, is whether that $100 million should be tagged to inflation or not. So the examples, I think, make it a whole lot more clear what EPA was trying to protect against with this draft rule. First of all, EPA may have neglected BCAs for regulations that are prohibited from considering costs. There are certainly rules that EPA is required to draft or update that cost is of no bearing. One example is the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. As EPA reevaluates these NAAQS regulations and what is healthy, they are not allowed to take into account costs on the economy. So EPA is now saying, even though revisiting the NAAQS regulations is prohibited from considering costs when you set that new value, we are still going to do a BCA and determine how much it's going to cost the economy. Second, in prior rulemaking efforts, EPA may have double counted some of the benefits that arise. You can think of this as regulations that hit industry twice, such as once with the new source performance standard and once for a MAC regulation. So EPA doesn't want to double count benefits from the prior rules when looking at a new rule. And third, EPA did not clearly distinguish benefit categories. What you can think here is reductions from non-target pollutants. This was somewhat common when EPA was developing regulations for greenhouse gas regulations, that they were counting the benefits from reduced fine particulate, or PM 2.5, in the atmosphere when developing greenhouse gas regulations. And the greenhouse gas regulations did not target PM 2.5, but EPA was counting that benefit in its analysis of the greenhouse gas regulations. Now, it doesn't prohibit EPA from doing that, but it wasn't clear before how much was due to fine particulates being reduced and how much was beneficial from greenhouse gas reduction in the atmosphere. So with this rule, EPA is kind of trying to clarify these three issues out there. So the fourth one here that I'll go into great detail on is the guidance on the PAL regulations. You know, these are called plant-wide applicability limitations. I know a lot of you aren't very familiar with these. They're not super common out there in the United States. So just as a recap, these PALs are for major facilities, PSD facilities, where instead of having individual limits on each emission unit, they give up those emission units to have an overall limit on the total facility. So if you can show ways to stay below these PAL levels, you are allowed to have very limited or no permitting to put in new units, as long as your facility can stay below those emission caps when those new units begin operation. These PAL permits last for 10 years, so kind of 2 Title V cycles, and then you have the option to renew those at the end. Some facilities are more aligned with the PAL permitting process, and some are not, and I'll kind of go through those at the end to kind of tell you who's good for the PALs and who's not such a good candidate for the PALs. And as I said before, when I did the introductions, I've done quite a few of these over the years, and I've had a lot of interaction with EPA. I think we were hoping for a little bit more from this final guidance document. It is a final guidance document. And I think they had an opportunity to go a lot further, and I'll kind of explain where I thought they could go farther and what we can do about it now with this final guidance document. So it is guidance. That means Mississippi has the option of following it or not. But I will tell you, most states, I think, will follow this one, because this is the first comprehensive guidance that we've ever had on the PAL permitting process. We've had a few, and I say very few guidance documents on specific portions of the PAL rule before, but this one is the first one that handles kind of 5 areas, the main 5 areas of PAL permitting. The first one is PAL reopening provisions by state agencies. Then we have the PAL expiration and how we distribute emissions if people want to get rid of their PAL permit. How do those emissions from the cap go back to the emissions units? The most interesting and by far the most comments the EPA received was on the renewal and emissions adjustments that may or may not be required at the end of your 10-year period. PAL termination and PAL monitoring requirements. And I'll kind of go into each one and tell you what EPA said in this guidance document, or what they didn't say in some cases. So first one was PAL reopening. If you didn't know, these state agencies, if they do note a NAAQS or PSD increment violation due to a facility or partially due to a facility with a PAL permit, they are allowed to reopen the PAL permit and lower the emission units to correct that issue. EPA basically said in this area that they have no evidence of any agency abusing this authority to open up a PAL and reduce it. So they didn't see any need to clarify when this could happen or when it can't happen out there. So basically, they punted on this one. On PAL expiration, they were pretty short. They said that facilities could establish new monitoring requirements that were not associated with the PAL when the PAL expired. And they also said that if you had previously, before you had your PAL, had some sort of of avoidance condition for PSD or non-attainment new source review that you did not have to reestablish those. You basically could take your emissions and distribute them to your emissions unit as you see fit and not go back to what your permit looked like prior to the PAL regulation. And all these reviewing provisions had oversight by the state agencies. They really punted on the PAL termination policy. So if someone was a facility, maybe bought another facility that had a PAL permit and wanted to terminate that they would handle that on a case-by-case basis. They really didn't provide any guidance on that whatsoever. As I said before, by far the most ink was dedicated to the PAL renewal process. Just to bring everyone up to speed on this to understand why, at the end of your 10-year PAL permit, you are required in your renewal application to determine what % of the total PAL cap you use during the PAL period. And if you are greater than 80% of those emission limits on a pollutant by pollutant basis, the PAL cap is to be kept the same number that it was in the initial term. If it is lower than 80% for any pollutant during that 10-year period, then the state agencies have discretion as to whether they need to lower that cap at all. And as you can imagine, if you are in a facility, not having some distinct guidelines on lowering emission limits can be very nerve-wracking as you go into a renewal period. So the crux of a lot of these comments were on emission units being existing or new when you look at their emissions in the previous 10-year period. Anything that's existing has to look at actual emissions. Anything that's considered new, an emissions unit considered new, gets to use potential. So those of you out there that are familiar with emissions units know that your existing emissions are usually much lower than your potential emissions. So it's very beneficial to characterize an emissions unit as new versus existing. So EPA went through this table where they define what would be new and what would be existing under a renewal scenario there. It still didn't go very far enough, and I'll kind of explain that when I go through some of the examples. I think EPA could have gone a lot farther here to help. But what EPA did say in their discussion of renewals is it was completely up to the state agency, that even if a regulated entity or facility came in and they were at 70% of the PAL, 50% of the PAL, or 30% of the PAL, the reviewing authority did not have to lower the PAL. They could keep the PAL exactly where it was, even at the low emission levels, if it could be justified. And they didn't explain why it could be justified. They gave a few examples. And I will tell you that in all of the renewals that I have done to date, I've had very few of them that were over 80% of the PAL limit. And most of the agencies were looking at those at keeping the PAL caps where they were. Kind of the final thing here that EPA discussed in this guidance memo, final guidance memo, was the monitoring requirements. They discussed 3 areas within that. Emission factor adjustments for uncertainty, so basically a safety factor, and how state agencies should apply that. They were very specific to say if you are going to apply a safety factor in your monitoring, basically the facility calculating their emissions on an annual basis to stay below the PAL cap, that same factor should be utilized in the emission limit cap itself. So it has to be equitable. Secondly, when it comes to stack testing or validation testing, that should only be required for significant emissions unit, and the emissions the reviewing authority or the state agencies have a discretion to use additional sources that are either at the site or within the industry. They don't have to get a stack test from every individual significant emissions unit there. Finally, on missing monitoring data, they've said that this would be very uncommon. And if you wanted to use SIMS or PIMS data and you were missing monitoring data, that you could basically do some data substitution similar to what is required in some other rules saying Part 60 or Part 75. So I did want to spend some time on PALs and where EPA and I agree that facilities are best suited for these and some that are not well suited for PAL permits, specifically based on the guidance that they released in August. First one is existing sites with predictable fluctuations in emissions are good candidates for PALs. You can think of this as an automotive assembly plant with VOC emissions from different model lines. You would want to set your PAL when you know that you were producing a large vehicle, hence using a lot of paint and producing a lot of VOC emissions. Therefore, if your plant ever shifted to a smaller vehicle with less paint, that you could utilize your excess emissions to produce more of that vehicle or look for gains in efficiency to get a higher throughput on that vehicle. So you do see a lot of auto assembly plants with PALs throughout the United States. Another good candidate are existing sites with economic advantages to lowering emissions. I know the example that I've had experience with are rubber tire plants where they're always trying to lower solvent use, in essence, lowering VOC emissions with lower solvent use at the facility. You could set your emissions, but when you started that campaign and as you lower solvent use, you would create cap space for yourself to again increase efficiency and throughput at the plant without having to get a new permit to do so. So sites that are not well suited for PALs would be existing sites that are predicted to emit more based off efficiency gains. And I think my best example of this are lumber mills that you see throughout the southern United States right now. They have shifted from batch operations to continuous operations, and in doing so, they are being able to produce a whole lot more lumber, dimensional lumber, on their existing footprint with the existing heat input. The reason that these are not good candidates for PAL permits is because a PAL permit, you get one significant emission rate increase for VOCs, that's 40 tons per year in that PAL term of 10 years. Once you go over that 40 tons per year, the next nanogram of emissions that you want to emit from your facility would require a PSD permit. Contrast that with the typical PSD permits out there that are not PALs, that for every project, and say you had 2, 3, or 4 of those projects in a 10-year period, each of those separate and distinct projects, you would be able to look at that 40 ton per year increase before you had to obtain a PSD permit. So you could get 3 bites at the apple or 4 bites at the apple there in a 10-year period, where a PAL permit could only get one of those. Second example that is not well suited for PALs, and this is probably the one that I had the most EPA heartburn with, is new sites where the emission units that are not yet built yet. EPA previously had allowed new units to utilize their PTE in establishing a PAL permit. Now you cannot do that because with the White Stallion decision out of Texas, EPA has said that no speculative emission units can be incorporated into a PAL. I don't necessarily agree with that, and I thought this guidance document, EPA had a good opportunity to undo the wrongs of the White Stallion decision, but they did not do that. So just know, if you have a new emission units or are planning new emission units at a facility, it's not a good time to get a PAL, because those new emission unit contributions, if they haven't been built yet, to your PAL would still be 0. So you'd have to come back in and reestablish or up your PAL once those new units got built.